February 14, 1943, 0640 hours, Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. A sandstorm splits open, and a Panzer IV fires from 300 yards. The shell hits an American Sherman in the turret ring, and the tank does not burn it. Erupts a column of orange flame punching 30 feet into the desert sky, the commander's hatch cartwheeling away with the man still in it. 44 American tanks die in the next 6 hours. Some crews never even see who killed them. They are chasing panzers that pretend to run, and behind those panzers wait the 88's dug-in hull, down invisible firing shells that travel faster than sound and go through American armor the way a nail goes through a paper cup. Men crawl out of the wrecks with their uniforms burning. Officers scream into radios that answer with static. Over 6,000 Americans will fall in the days that follow. 3,000 of them will walk east into German cages. Nearly 200 tanks will be left smoking on the sand, many of them untouched abandoned keys still in the ignition. And watching it all through field glasses, a German field marshal named Erwin Rommel makes the biggest mistake of his life. He decides he has learned who the Americans are. Before we go further, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes in this series. Come with us as we dig up more forgotten stories, decisive moments, and the human courage buried inside the biggest war in history. Join our community. The best part of this story is still coming. 12 miles behind that burning ridge, a 26-year-old man named Ray Kowalski is lying in a drainage ditch with a field telephone pressed to his ear and no one on the other end. Before the war, he fixed transmissions in a garage on the east side of Toledo, Ohio. He has grease permanently under his fingernails. He is not a hero, not a West Point man, not anyone's idea of a warrior. He is an artillery forward observer, which in February 1943 is the most useless job in the United States Army. In 13 months, the system that Kowalski and men like him will build out of scavenged radio parts and a stolen idea will call down the fire of an entire corps onto a single German machine gun in a single hedgerow in Normandy. 30 panzers will die in 12 minutes at a crossroads called El Guetar. The elite Panzer Lehr Division, the best armored division in the German army, will report itself annihilated by an enemy it never sees. But right now on Valentine's Day, 1943, Ray Kowalski is lying in a ditch, and the American army is dying around him, and he cannot get a single gun to fire. The army that landed in North Africa believed it was ready. On paper, it was magnificent. It came from the largest industrial machine the planet had ever assembled. A torrent of men and steel poured across the beaches. Fresh M4 Shermans straight off the line in Detroit. Fleets of trucks. Mountains of rations. An endless river of 18-year-olds who had never heard a shot fired in anger. By every measure of production and logistics, the U.S. II Corps was formidable. But an army is not an assembly line. It is a living organism, and this one had never breathed combat air. Its brain was made of theory. American doctrine in 1942 was born in the fields of Louisiana and the deserts of California in maneuvers where the umpires blew whistles and the dead got up for lunch. It worshipped firepower and process. Problems were to be solved methodically by the book with the manual open. The Germans they were about to meet had thrown their manual away in 1940 and written a new one in blood from El Alamein to the Egyptian frontier. And nobody symbolized the disconnect like the man commanding 2nd Corps Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall. Fredendall's obsession in Tunisia was not the enemy. It was his command post. 70 miles behind the front, he set an entire battalion of combat engineers to work for 3 weeks blasting tunnels and chambers out of a rocky hillside, building a concrete fortress with separate entrances and exits hardened against an air raid that was never remotely possible. Those engineers were desperately needed at the front, clearing minefields, building bridges. Instead, they dug him a hole to hide in. From inside that hole, Fredendall tried to command a battlefield he never visited. His orders were a fog of homespun slang. He referred to units not by designation, but as the boys on the hill. He told commanders to go get them, to plug the hole, drawing lines on a map with no idea of the terrain or the enemy sitting on it. It was leadership by remote control, and the signal was fatally weak. The consequences were arithmetic. At Sidi Bouzid, Colonel Drake's combat command was ordered to counterattack a force it could not see. With tanks it did not know how to fight. They rolled forward across open plain in neat parade ground formation, spotted German panzers, and gave chase when the panzers withdrew. It was bait. It had been bait in the desert for 2 years, and the Germans could run the play in their sleep. The Americans crested a low ridge, and a screen of hidden 8.8-centimeter flak guns, firing horizontally, tore 53 Shermans down to 9 in an afternoon. The artillery that could have saved them, the 12 howitzers of the supporting battalion, fired almost nothing. Not because the guns were bad. American guns were superb. Because nobody could tell them where. That was the disease. Every American artillery battery was a private kingdom. Each battalion answered to its own commander. Each observer talked to his own battery, and only his own battery. Request for fire crawled up a chain of command, through 3 or 4 headquarters, got argued about, got approved, and arrived 25 minutes later at coordinates the Germans had left 20 minutes ago. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air fought 4 separate wars on the same square mile of dirt. German intelligence read the after-action picture and called American combined arms infantile. They were being generous, but everything was about to change because of a man nobody was paying attention to. Ray Kowalski was not supposed to be in Tunisia. He had a deferment, a mother, and a garage that would have been his in 5 years. He enlisted 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor because his older brother had been on a destroyer at Cavite, and the telegram came on a Tuesday. The Army looked at his file, saw mechanic, and made him an artilleryman. This was the single luckiest accident of his life and possibly of the war. Because a garage mechanic in 1937 was something very specific. Kowalski could pull a Ford flathead down to bare block on a dirt floor by lantern light. He could hear a bad bearing through a closed hood. But more than that, he had spent 5 years fixing radios as a sideline, because in Toledo in the Depression, a man fixed anything that came through the door for $1. Vacuum tubes, capacitors, antenna theory learned out of a 15-cent pamphlet. At Fort Sill, the instructors taught fire direction as mathematics. Kowalski understood it as plumbing. Fire was water. The guns were the reservoir. The observer was the tap. And the entire American system, he realized in a classroom in Oklahoma, had built a beautiful reservoir and then connected it to the tap with a garden hose full of kinks. He said so. A lieutenant told him to shut up and do the trigonometry. Then came Sidi Bouzid, and Ray Kowalski lay in that drainage ditch and watched the thing he had complained about kill men he knew. He could see with his own eyes 3 separate German positions. A battery of 88s on a ridge. A fuel column stopped in a wadi. An infantry company forming up in a palm grove. He had within 8 miles of that ditch roughly 72 American artillery pieces sitting silent, waiting for orders. He had 1 working handset connected to 1 battery, whose captain told him the request had to go through battalion, and battalion had lost contact with regiment, and regiment was somewhere behind a hill that now had German tanks on it. 300 yards away, a Sherman crew burned to death inside their tank, while 72 guns sat idle because the paperwork was on fire. And then, on a night that would decide more than anyone in that ditch could imagine, Kowalski walked into his battalion's tent with a piece of cardboard, a captured German map, and an idea so far outside regulation that his own major would call it insane. The idea was this: 1 man, 1 radio, 1 voice commands, every gun in range, not his battery, not his battalion. Every tube of every battalion within reach, regardless of who owned it, regardless of who outranked whom. All of them slave to a single room called a fire direction center. The observer would not request fire. The observer would order fire directly on an open net, and the guns would answer in under 3 minutes without a single officer's permission. Here is the plumbing version. Imagine a fire station in a city where each engine company only answers calls from its own neighborhood, and every alarm has to be relayed through City Hall, and City Hall has gone to lunch. Kowalski's idea was to rip out City Hall entirely. 1 alarm box. Every engine in the city rolls. simultaneously. The mathematics that made it possible were the part nobody wanted to hear. If you know precisely where every gun is and precisely where the target is, you can compute a different time of flight for each battalion, because a battery 11 miles out needs longer than a battery 4 miles out. Fire the far guns first. Fire the near guns last. Stagger the trigger pulls by seconds. And every shell from every battery fired from a dozen scattered positions across 40 square miles lands in the same field within the same heartbeat. No warning whistle. No ranging shots. No time to get into a hole. The first thing the enemy hears is the world ending. They would eventually call it time on target. In February 1943, in a tent in Tunisia, they called it 3 other things. Insane, because it handed a sergeant with a radio the destructive authority of a general. Forbidden, because doctrine said an artillery battalion supported its assigned unit and nobody else. And reassigning fire on the fly was a violation of command structure so basic that an officer could be relieved for it. And suicidal, because it required every observer to transmit on an open frequency, in the clear, constantly, and the Germans were listening to American radio traffic and laughing at it. The major laughed too. He told Kowalski that if he wanted to command a corps, he should have gone to the point. He told him the ammunition expenditure alone was criminal, that no army on earth could feed guns firing like that. He told him to get out of his tent. Kowalski got out of the tent. And then he did something that should have ended with him breaking rocks in a stockade for 10 years. He went and found the other observers. 6 of them. Enlisted men, a couple of scared lieutenants. Men from Ohio and Alabama and Queens, who had all been lying in their own ditches watching their own friends burn. And he told them that the next time it started, they were not going to ask anybody for permission. They had no idea that this decision would save thousands of lives. The setup took 11 days and everything they could steal. They needed a room, so they took a farmhouse cellar. They needed a plotting table, so they broke up a door. They needed a firing chart accurate to 50 yards across 40 square miles, so they surveyed it themselves at night on foot, with a captured German theodolite and a tape measure in territory that was not entirely theirs. Kowalski rewired 6 SCR 284 radio sets to hold a common frequency, cannibalizing tubes from a wrecked half-track hand, winding a coil around a broom handle, because the correct part was in a warehouse in Casablanca. Then the whole thing nearly died, because a full colonel walked into the cellar and asked what the hell was going on. He found a garage mechanic from Toledo standing over a stolen door covered in pencil marks, explaining that he intended to fire the guns of 3 battalions he did not command on his own authority at targets nobody had approved. There is a version of this story where the colonel has Kowalski arrested. That version is the one that happens in almost every army on Earth in 1943. But by then, Lloyd Friedendahl was gone. Eisenhower had flown to the shattered front on February 25th, looked at the abandoned equipment and the shell-shocked faces, and understood that the disease was at the top. On March 6th, Friedendahl was relieved. The man who replaced him arrived like an occupation, took one look at that 70-mile deep bunker, and moved his headquarters into tents at the front. George Patton fired incompetence on sight and promoted anyone who showed teeth. And the word came down through every level of Second Corps in a weak initiative would no longer be punished. The colonel looked at the plotting table for a long moment. Then he asked one question. How fast? Kowalski said, 3 minutes. The colonel said, prove it. They proved it at 0420 on a cold morning against a German reconnaissance element moving through a wadi 11 miles from the nearest American gun. 1 observer, 1 transmission 41 seconds long. 54 guns from 3 battalions staggered by time of flight firing on a target none of their crews could see or had ever heard of. The shells arrived together, all of them, in 1 second. When the observer crawled forward at dawn, there was nothing recognizable in that wadi, not vehicles, not men. Churned earth and a single boot. In the cellar, nobody cheered. The lieutenant who had run the plotting table sat down on the floor and put his hands over his face because he had just understood completely what they had built. It was not a tactic. It was an industrial process for erasing points on a map, and it could be taught to anyone, and it could be scaled to the size of a continent. But this was only the beginning. Late March. El Guitar. The 10th Panzer Division attacked exactly as it had at Sidi Bouzid, expecting exactly what it got at Sidi Bouzid. The 1st Infantry Division dug in and refused to break. And when the panzers came into the open plain, an observer lying far forward with the infantry spoke into a radio for less than a minute. Over 30 panzers died in the next 12 minutes. Not in glorious duels. Not killed by braver men. Killed by an invisible voice in a ditch and a wall of high explosive that fell out of a clear sky with no warning at all. The German attack shattered before it truly began. They regrouped, came again, and the line held. For the first time in North Africa, a major German armored assault against Americans was stopped cold. And here is where the war was decided, though nobody knew it that day. The German after-action reports noted the stubbornness of the 1st Division and attributed it to that unit's particular quality. They noted the artillery and called it a lucky break, an anomaly. Their diagnosis from Kasserine stood: the Americans were materially rich, morally brittle, badly led, and incapable of real combined arms. Rommel had seen the truth in February, and he could not imagine the truth was subject to change. He would take that diagnosis to Normandy. He would build the entire defense of Fortress Europe on it. Hit them hard in the first 24 hours, and they will shatter. The Americans had learned from their failure. The Germans had learned the wrong lesson from their success. But could a garage mechanic's radio trick survive contact with the real German army? The one that hadn't been starved and stranded at the end of a broken supply line? Could it work in hedgerows where you couldn't see 50 yards against Panzer Lehr, against the hand-picked instructors of Germany's armored schools? Rommel was about to answer that question himself from the wrong side of the beach. In Part 2, we follow Ray Kowalski's system out of the desert and into the bocage, where a single American voice in a ditch will annihilate the finest division in the German army in 3 weeks, and its commander will send back a report using the exact phrase the Germans once used to describe the Americans morally beaten. Ray Kowalski, a transmission mechanic from Toledo, Ohio, looked at the American artillery system and saw a fire station where every engine waited for permission from a city hall that had gone to lunch. He tore out City Hall. One voice, one radio, every gun in range shells, from a dozen scattered batteries, landing in the same field, in the same second. At El Guitar, it killed 30 panzers in 12 minutes. And it should have ended there with a promotion and a handshake. Instead, within 6 weeks of El Guitar, Ray Kowalski was standing at attention in a requisitioned villa outside Algiers, while a brigadier general read him a document that could have put him in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. The charge was not incompetence. The charge was the opposite. In the spring of 1943, the United States Army had roughly 4,800 field artillery pieces in North Africa and Britain. Not one of them was authorized to fire on the word of an enlisted man. Kowalski had done it 209 times. And this is where everything got worse. The man holding the document was Brigadier General Harlan Vance, and he was not a fool, which was the problem. Fools are easy. Vance had commanded a battery at Chateau Thierry in 1918. He had watched American artillery in that war fire the largest barrages in history at map squares where nothing was on schedules printed 3 days in advance, while infantry died 200 yards from guns that could not be told to stop. He had spent 25 years building the American fire direction system to make sure that never happened again. He had written pieces of the manual himself. Every layer of approval in that chain, every headquarters that Kowalski had bypassed, existed because Harlan Vance had watched men die from a mistake and had put a lock on that door with his own hands. Now a sergeant was picking those locks with a broom handle and a stolen theodolite. "You fired 3 battalions," Vance said. He did not raise his voice. "Battalions assigned to a division you do not belong to on the authority of a corporal in a ditch with a radio nobody was monitoring." "Yes, sir." "You transmitted grid coordinates in the clear, on an open net. The Germans have been reading our traffic since Oran." "Yes, sir." "Do you know what happens the first time you're wrong?" "Not the 10th, the first. You put 54 guns on a grid square, and the observer transposed 2 digits, and you have just erased an American rifle company, and there is no officer anywhere in the chain who could have caught it because you removed them all. Kowalski said nothing because the general was right. That was the terrible part. Every objection Vance made was correct. There is a reason for the chain, Sergeant. The reason is buried in France. The pressure was not abstract. In May 1943, the Tunisian campaign ended, and the American Army began the largest reorganization in its history, aimed at a coastline nobody would name out loud. Every doctrinal decision made that summer would be frozen into the training of 2 million men. Whatever the manual said in August would be what a farm boy from Kansas did on a beach in the dark. There was no time to test, no time to argue, no time to be wrong. Vance's own staff estimated that changing the fire direction doctrine Army-wide would require retraining 40,000 artillerymen and rewriting the curriculum of every school in the system. On a deadline, nobody would state for an invasion, nobody would confirm. Kowalski was informed he would be reassigned to a depot in Casablanca, where he would inventory spare parts until the war ended. But he found an ally where he never expected one. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Emmerich had been sitting in the back of that room the entire time, and he had said nothing. He was a thin, unimpressive man who had taught gunnery mathematics at Fort Sill for 6 years, and whom nobody at Sill had particularly liked. He caught Kowalski in the courtyard afterward. "Your time of flight tables," Emmerich said. "You computed them by hand." "Yes, sir." "For 11 batteries at different ranges, simultaneously, in a cellar." "With a slide rule, sir. It took an hour the first time. Takes 4 minutes now." Emmerich was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that changed the war. "I've been trying to get the Army to do that since 1938. They told me it was mathematically sound and institutionally impossible. You didn't ask them." Emmerich believed for a reason that had nothing to do with courage. He had run the numbers. He knew that against a dug-in enemy, a barrage that warns the target is roughly 70% wasted because the first shell sends every man on that ground into a hole, and the next 200 shells shake dirt on a man who is already safe. Only the first salvo kills. Emmerich's calculation was brutally simple. If every shell became a first salvo, you did not need more guns. You needed the same guns to be worth 6 times as much. That was 4,800 pieces suddenly fighting like 28,000 without producing a single additional barrel. Emmerich went to Vance with a proposal, and Vance, being an honest man, agreed to the only terms that could kill the idea cleanly. 1 demonstration, 1 target, live fire observed by the Corps staff. If it failed, the system died and Kowalski went to Casablanca. If a single round landed outside the impact area, Emmerich's career ended with it. They had 9 days. The logistics were a war of their own. They needed 12 battalions on a common frequency, which meant 144 guns and 3,000 men, who all reported to different colonels, none of whom had any reason to cooperate. Emmerich got them by trading a shipment of tires, a promise about billets, a favor, called in from a classmate at 5th Army headquarters. They needed survey control across 60 square miles, and they got it by putting every man Kowalski trusted into trucks for 6 consecutive nights with tape measures and lanterns. They needed radios that would hold a frequency in desert heat, and Kowalski hand-wound 37 coils himself, sitting on an ammunition crate until his fingers bled through the tape. The day of the test came. If it failed, an idea that could save 100,000 American lives would die in a manual, and no one would ever know. June 14, 1943. A dry valley 40 miles inland. 6 o'clock, already 90 degrees. The observers came in staff cars. 11 officers from Corps 3 from 5th Army, and Vance, who stood apart with his hands behind his back and did not speak to anyone. The target was a mock-up. Engineers had spent 3 days building it, a battery position with dummy guns, a fuel dump, and 40 vehicles spread across a rectangle 400 yards by 600 yards in a shallow wadi with good cover. It was deliberately exactly what the 88 screen at Sidi Bouzid had looked like. Vance had chosen it himself. The 12 battalions were positioned between 4 and 14 miles away. Not one gun crew could see the valley. Not one battery commander had been told what the target was. They had been told only to be laid loaded and listening. Kowalski went forward alone with one radio and one pair of binoculars and lay down in a scrape of rock 2,200 yards from the wadi at 0640, in the cellar that served as the fire direction center. Emmerich stood over a plotting table with 6 computers, all of them enlisted men, all of them under 23. Vance stood behind them with a stopwatch. At 07:02, Kowalski transmitted. Voice on the open net. Flat, Ohio. No ceremony. Target grid. Description. Battery position fuel vehicles. Request course time on target mark 0711. 9 minutes. Vance clicked the stopwatch and said to nobody, "He's giving them 9 minutes to make an error 12 different ways." What happened next in that cellar was not drama. It was arithmetic performed very fast by very tired young men. Each battalion's range was different, so each battalion's shell would spend a different amount of time in the air. The 155s at 14 miles needed 51 seconds of flight. The 105s at 4 miles needed 19, so the far guns had to fire first, and the near guns last, staggered down to the second, every crew pulling its lanyard at a different moment so that every shell arrived at the same one. 12 battalions. 12 different firing times. One impact. At 7:07, a problem. The plotting officer's face went white. One battalion, the 219th, was reporting a survey discrepancy of 180 yards. Their position on the chart and their position on the earth did not agree. Emmerich looked at Vance. Vance said nothing. This was the moment the entire system was supposed to break, because in the old world you stopped, you asked, you sent it up the chain, you waited 25 minutes. Emmerich said, "Drop the 219th, recompute 11, go." 4 minutes. 11 battalions. A 19-year-old from Scranton did the trigonometry with a slide rule while sweat dripped onto the chart. The firing commands went out at 07:09 and 07:10, a staccato of different times to different guns scattered across 60 square miles of nothing. At 07:11:00, Kowalski, lying on hot rock, heard nothing at all. Then the air above the wadi tore. There was no whistle. There was no ranging round. There was no first shell to warn anybody because there was no first shell. There were 132 of them, and they arrived in the same second. And the wadi ceased to be a place and became a phenomenon, a single detonation half a mile wide that lifted rock and steel and dust 600 feet into the sky in one convulsion. The shockwave hit the observing officers a full 4 seconds later and knocked 2 of them off their feet. When the dust cleared at 7:19, the officers walked the impact area. The mock-up was gone. Not damaged. Gone. 38 of the 40 vehicles were destroyed or overturned. Every dummy gun was scrap. The fuel dump had burned so hot the sand had fused. Engineers who inspected the site estimated that anything living in that rectangle would have had 0 warning and 0 survivors outside a concrete bunker. Compare that to Sidi Bouzid. 4 months earlier, an American artillery battalion had taken 25 minutes to respond to a call for fire, had fired 400 rounds on a German position, and the Germans had walked away from it. Kowalski's system 9 minutes from voice to impact, 132 rounds, total destruction. The officers did not cheer. They stood in the fused sand and looked at each other, and one of them, a colonel from 5th Army, who had been openly hostile in the car that morning, took off his helmet and said quietly, "God have mercy on anyone we point that at." Vance walked the length of the impact area alone. Then he came back to where Kowalski and Emmerich were standing, and he was holding the stopwatch, and his hand was shaking slightly, and it was not fear. 25 years, he said. I built the locks to keep this from happening. He looked at the crater. And you built the thing the locks were keeping out. He turned to Emmerich. Write it, all of it, every table, every procedure, every failure mode. I wanted it still in 3 weeks. Then to Kowalski, and this was the only time anyone heard him say it. You were right, and I was right, Sergeant. That's what makes it a tragedy that it took until 1943. They called it Time on Target. TOT. But succeeding in a test is one thing. The Army adopted it, and then discovered that adoption is not the same as ability. The mathematics were the easy part. The hard part was 40,000 men. Every battalion needed a fire direction center that could compute 11 simultaneous firing solutions in 4 minutes under fire at night exhausted. Every battalion needed survey control accurate to 50 yards over 60 square miles, which meant survey teams working in front of the infantry. And every observer, every one of them, had to be a man the Army was willing to hand the destructive power of a corps. Kowalski spent the autumn of 1943 in England in freezing Quonset huts teaching. He was by then a warrant officer, which fooled nobody. He walked into battalions where full colonels had been firing artillery since Kowalski was in grade school and told them their entire professional life had been organized wrong. They fought him. Not out of stupidity, out of experience. A colonel in Devon told him flatly, "In combat, that cellar of yours takes 1 shell and every gun in the corps goes deaf. My way, I lose a battery. Your way, I lose an army." Kowalski said, "Sir, at Sidi Bouzid, we had 72 guns in range, and I watched a Sherman crew burn to death because I couldn't reach any of them. Your way already lost an army. I was there when it happened." The colonel trained his men. The proof came in Italy that winter. At Anzio, in February 1944, a German counteroffensive drove for the beachhead with everything the 14th Army had, and it walked into fire it could not understand. On February 16th, American observers on the Mussolini Canal put the massed artillery of the entire beachhead onto German assembly areas again and again, 10 and 12 battalions at a time, shells arriving with no warning whatsoever. The German attack lost an estimated 5,000 men in 3 days. German prisoners were interrogated, and the reports were baffled. They insisted the Americans had a new weapon, some kind of automatic gun. They could not accept that the sky simply opened without warning. A German artillery officer captured near Cisterna said something that should have terrified Berlin. He had counted the impacts, and by his count, the Americans had fired more guns at his single company than his division possessed in total. An idea that had been laughed out of a tent in Tunisia was now doctrine printed, taught, and killing Germans at scale. Which is exactly when the Germans started paying attention. Because in the spring of 1944, German signals intelligence began systematically recording American fire direction traffic. They had the transmissions. They had the frequencies. They had captured observers, captured radios, captured manuals from Italy. And on the Atlantic Wall, engineers began pouring concrete to a new specification. Thicker roofs, deeper positions, dispersal, everything designed around the assumption that the Americans could put a corps of artillery anywhere they could see. Anywhere they could see. Erwin Rommel would build his entire defense of Normandy on a single insight drawn from that intelligence. The American system needed eyes. Take away the observer, and the guns are blind. And in the hedgerow country of the Bocage, in fields walled by earth banks 8 feet high where a man cannot see 50 yards, no observer on earth could see anything at all. The Germans had finally learned. They had found the one place on the continent where Ray Kowalski's system could not work, and they were going to make the Americans fight there. A garage mechanic from Toledo tore out the middle of the American artillery system and replaced it with one voice on an open radio. They laughed at him in a tent in Tunisia. 11 months later, it was doctrine printed and taught to 40,000 men, and at Anzio, it killed 5,000 Germans in 3 days. While prisoners swore the Americans had invented some kind of automatic gun. The Germans stopped laughing. They started studying. By May 1944, German signals intelligence had assembled a file on American fire direction that ran to hundreds of pages. Captured manuals from Italy. Captured observers. Captured radios opened and traced circuit by circuit. And out of that file came a single conclusion so clean it became the foundation of the defense of France. The American system has eyes. Blind the eyes, and the guns are 4,800 pieces of expensive iron pointed at nothing. And in Normandy, God had already built the blindfold. This was no longer a test. This was the end of the argument. The German assessment was not panic. It was professional, cold, and largely correct, which made it far more dangerous. Colonel Anton Staubwasser's intelligence section at Army Group B laid it out for Rommel. In the spring, American artillery response times in Italy had collapsed from an average of 25 minutes to under 10, and in some sectors, under 5. Ammunition expenditure was not the story. The story was that every American round now arrived without warning. A German battery could survive 400 shells fired the old way. It could not survive 130 arriving in the same second. The countermeasures came fast. German doctrine in the West was rewritten around 3 ideas. Disperse, never assemble in daylight, never in the open, never within sight of high ground. Dig roofs went from concrete 2 feet thick to 5, and hunt the observers. A specific order went out to the divisions of 7th Army in June 1944, designating American forward observers as the highest priority target on the battlefield above tanks, above officers, above artillery itself. Snipers were instructed to look not for rank insignia, but for radio antennas. Kill the man with the wire and a division of guns goes deaf. The Germans built an entire theory of victory on it. Rommel's argument to von Rundstedt, the argument he lost and then partially won, was that the invasion had to be crushed at the waterline. But when it wasn't, when the Allies got ashore on June 6th and stayed, the fallback was the bocage. The hedgerow country of Normandy is the most defensively perfect terrain in Western Europe, and no one on the Allied planning staff had seriously accounted for it. These were not hedges, they were earthbanks, 4 to 8 feet high, 1,000 years old, rooted with trees running along every field boundary, in a maze that turned the countryside into 10,000 walled rooms. Sight lines 40 yards, sometimes 20. A forward observer in the bocage could not see the next field, let alone a German battery 8 miles away. The German plan worked immediately, and it worked horrifically. In the first 6 weeks after D-Day, American casualties in Normandy ran to over 100,000. The 90th Infantry Division lost 100% of its original enlisted strength and 150% of its officers. Advances were measured in hedgerows per day, sometimes 1, sometimes 0. And Kowalski's system, the miracle of Anzio, the thing that made 48 guns fight like 300, was reduced to firing map data at coordinates nobody could confirm because there was nothing to see. German prisoners taken in July were confident. They said so on the record to interrogators. One captured Panzerlehr officer told a lieutenant of the 2nd Armored Division that the Americans had built a machine for killing in open country and had then chosen to fight in a country with no openings. But the terrain was not the only thing breaking. On July 25, 1944, near St. Lo, the American Army did something that would haunt it forever. Operation Cobra opened with the largest tactical bombardment ever attempted, 1,500 heavy bombers dropping on a rectangle 7,000 yards wide directly in front of American lines. The bomb line was marked with smoke. The wind shifted. The smoke drifted north over American positions, and wave after wave of B-17 bombed the marker. 111 Americans died under American bombs. 490 were wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American killed in Europe, blown out of a foxhole so completely they identified him by his collar insignia. The recriminations were instant and vicious. And a version of the blame landed on the fire direction people, because the man who had spent 2 years telling the United States Army that coordination could be trusted to a voice on a radio was now standing in the middle of a field that had just proved the opposite. In a tent at 1st Army headquarters, a staff colonel said it to Ray Kowalski's face, "You taught them the sky as a tool. Look at what fell out of it." Kowalski, by then a captain, did not have an answer. There is a photograph of him from that week, or there would be if he had been anyone worth photographing, a man sitting on an ammunition crate outside St. Lo at 3 in the morning, not sleeping, holding a slide rule he was not using. Peter Emmerich, now a full colonel, found him there. They're saying the system killed McNair. Kowalski said. The system didn't kill McNair. Wind killed McNair. And the fact that a heavy bomber at 20,000 feet cannot hear an observer on the ground. Emmerich sat down. Which is your point, Ray? It has always been your point. Fire has to belong to the man who can see. Nobody can see anything in this country. Then get above it. The idea had been there since Tunisia, small and unglamorous, and mostly ignored. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper. A civilian light plane with a fabric skin, a 65 horsepower engine, no armor, no weapons, and a top speed slower than a truck. Artillery units use them for spotting. Nobody thought much about them. Kowalski thought about them for the rest of that night. The Bocage blinded a man standing in it. It did not blind a man 800 feet above it. And the German countermeasure, the whole beautiful architecture of it, hunting the observers, killing the man with the antenna, was built on the assumption that the observer was standing on the ground where a sniper could reach him. Then came Mortain, and everything changed. August 6, 1944. Hitler, over the objections of every general in France, ordered Operation Lüttich, 4 panzer divisions, roughly 120 tanks, and 25,000 men, to punch west from Mortain to Avranches. 30 kilometers cut Patton's Third Army off at the base of the Cotentin and split the Allied lodgment in half. It was the largest German armored counterattack in the West. And it was aimed at a single American division, the 30th Infantry, holding a 10-mile front with 8,000 men. 0030, August 7th. No artillery preparation. The Germans come in the dark, in fog engines, throttled down deliberately to preserve surprise. It works. The 2nd SS Panzer Division cuts through the American line and takes Mortain in 90 minutes. The 1st SS drives up the Say Valley. By 300, the German spearheads are 4 miles in, and on a bare hill east of Mortain, called Hill, 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, wake up surrounded. They are cut off, completely. No road out, no reinforcement possible. And on that hill are 2 artillery observers, Lieutenant Robert Weiss and Lieutenant Charles Bartz, with radios. Hill 314 is 1,030 feet high. It is the highest ground for miles. From it, in daylight, you can see the entire German attack. Weiss gets on the net at first light. What happens next is the argument of Ray Kowalski's life, settled in 8 days on a hill nobody had heard of. The fog burns off at 800. The typhoons and thunderbolts come, but the aircraft leave. The guns never do. Weiss calls the first mission. 12 battalions answer. Not his battalion. Every battalion in range from 3 divisions, guns belonging to colonels who have never heard his name and do not need to. Grid. Description. Core time on target. 9 minutes. Then the sky opens over a German assembly area, and 144 shells arrive in the same second on men who never heard a whistle. Then he does it again, and again. August 7th. Weiss and Bartz call in fire missions continuously through daylight. German infantry attacks the hill 6 times. 6 times the assault forms up, and 6 times the ground where it forms up ceases to exist. The Germans cannot understand it. They are being annihilated in staging areas 4 miles from the hill, in dead ground behind ridges and orchards, places no man on that hill could possibly see with binoculars, except that he can because he is 1,030 feet up, and the countryside is spread beneath him like a map. August 8th. Weiss is directing the massed artillery of 2 corps. He is a lieutenant. He is calling for and receiving the fire of over 200 guns. The Germans finally understand and try the only answer left. They mass artillery on Hill 314 itself, and they attack it with everything, because everyone can now see that the hill is the reason Operation Lüttich is dying. August 9th. The men on 314 run out of food, then water, then morphine. The wounded lie in the open in August heat. Attempts to airdrop supplies fail. The containers fall into German hands. The artillery fires 155mm shells with the explosive removed and medical supplies packed inside. Most shatter on impact. August 10th. The Germans send an officer under white flag to demand surrender. He offers to evacuate the American wounded who are dying by the hour. Lieutenant Ralph Curley refuses. They hold. Weiss keeps calling fire. He calls it for 8 days. His voice on the net becomes a kind of legend among the gunners. The man on the hill still there, still shooting. By August 12th, Operation Lüttich is finished. The German spearheads never reach Avranches. They never reach halfway. Of the roughly 120 tanks committed, over 100 are destroyed or abandoned. The 2nd SS Panzer Division is broken, and Hitler's counterattack, instead of splitting the Allies, has driven 4 panzer divisions into a sack from which the only exit is a gap near a town called Falaise. When the 35th Division breaks through to Hill 314 on August 12th, they find 357 men alive out of roughly 700. The dead lie where they fell. The survivors cannot stand. Robert Weiss is credited with directing 193 fire missions from that hill. American commanders would later assess the artillery observed from Hill 314 as the single decisive factor in stopping the largest German counterattack in the West. A German battalion commander captured near Mortain said it plainly to his interrogator. He said his men were not defeated by American infantry. He said they were killed by a man on a hill with a radio, and that there was no way to fight him because you cannot shoot a voice. The news of Mortain traveled fast, and it traveled in 2 directions. For the Americans, it was proof final and public. Within weeks, corps-level time on target was standard practice across the entire 12th Army Group. And the Piper Cubs went up in numbers nobody had authorized on paper. By late 1944, roughly 1,600 of them were flying in Europe, unarmed fabric airplanes, droning at 800 feet, and they became the most feared American weapon in the German Army's experience of the war. German units stopped moving when a Cub appeared. Simply stopped. Tanks reversed into barns. Columns dispersed. An entire panzer division could be paralyzed for an afternoon by 1 civilian aircraft with a lieutenant and a radio in it. The numbers tell the rest. German artillery in the West was outfired by conservative estimate at ratios approaching 10-1. Post-war analysis of German casualties in Normandy attributed somewhere between 50 and 75% of all losses to artillery. Not to tanks. Not to aircraft. To guns directed by voices. And the German response was to change everything. Movement in the West became a nocturnal activity. Assembly became forbidden. The Wehrmacht. The army that had invented the lightning armored thrust could no longer concentrate force in daylight anywhere within 8 miles of an American observer, and by the autumn of 1944, that meant it could no longer concentrate force at all. A German general captured that year gave the answer that ended the debate forever in Russia. When we saw a column of tanks, we prepared the anti-tank guns. In Normandy, when we saw a column of tanks, we went to the air raid shelter. The Kasserine diagnosis was ash. Rommel had looked at burning Shermans in February 1943 and seen a permanent portrait of a soft, amateur, morally brittle enemy. What he had actually been looking at was a student on the first day of class. Robert Weiss received the Distinguished Service Cross. The 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, received a Presidential Unit Citation. Peter Emmerich was decorated and promoted. Ray Kowalski received a piece of paper. Because here is the last turn of this story, the part that nobody puts in the documentaries. The system that broke the German army in the West has no father. It has no monument. There is no plaque at Fort Sill with a mechanic's name on it, no medal citation, no chapter in a memoir. The most important American tactical innovation of the Second World War was created by men whose names dissolved into a procedure, and a procedure cannot be given a Medal of Honor. So, what happened to the man who tore out City Hall? In Part 4, what Ray Kowalski was doing on the day the war ended, why the Army buried the story of who actually invented time on target, what the Germans wrote in their final assessments when they finally, far too late, understood exactly what had killed them, and the one question that has haunted military historians for 80 years. Because armies do not lose wars when they are outgunned. They lose when they decide they already know the answer. There is one chapter left. Almost nobody knows it. A garage mechanic from Toledo lay in a ditch in Tunisia in February 1943 and watched a Sherman crew burn to death while 72 American guns sat silent 8 miles away waiting for paperwork. He decided the paperwork was the enemy. He built a system in a farmhouse cellar out of a broken door, a stolen theodolite, and coils wound around a broom handle. They called it insane, forbidden, and suicidal. 18 months later, on a bare hill in Normandy, that system destroyed the largest German armored counterattack in the West, and a captured German battalion commander said his men had not been beaten by soldiers, but killed by a voice they could not shoot. So what happened to Ray Kowalski? Here is the last turn of this story, and it is not the one you are expecting. It is not a medal ceremony. It is not a parade. There is a twist waiting at the end of this, and it has been sitting in plain sight in the archives for 80 years, and almost nobody has ever put it together. Because sometimes the price of being right is that the world stops needing you to be there. The war ended for Ray Kowalski on a Tuesday afternoon in a Quonset hut in Germany doing paperwork. That is the truth of it. And it is the truth of almost everyone who actually built the machine that won that war. There was no moment. He was 30 years old, a captain, and on the day the news came through, he was reviewing survey control data for an artillery group that would never fire again. He walked outside. Men were shouting. Someone fired a flare. He sat down on a crate the same way he had sat down on a crate outside St. Lo a year earlier, and he did not cry, and he did not cheer. He thought about his brother, who had been on a destroyer at Cavite in December 1941, and who had never learned that his kid brother had done anything at all. He went home in November 1945 with a Bronze Star, which the Army gave out by the tens of thousands, and a discharge paper and $300. There was no chapter in a memoir, no plaque at Fort Sill, no citation that said invented time on target, because no citation could, because by 1945, time on target was not an invention. It was simply how the United States Army fired artillery, the way water is simply how you put out a fire. It had no author. It had a procedure number. The most decisive American tactical innovation of the Second World War had been absorbed so completely into doctrine that it became invisible, and the men who built it were dissolved into it. And here is the part that should make you angry, and then make you think. Ray Kowalski went back to Toledo. He bought the garage. He fixed transmissions for 31 years. He married a woman named Alice who worked at the parts counter, and they had 3 children, and he coached baseball badly, and he never once, not at a single family dinner, not at a single VFW hall, told the story you have just spent 90 minutes listening to. His son found out in 1979. A man came into the garage, an older man, a stranger, and stood there a long time watching Kowalski work under a car. And then he said, "Sir, were you at Sidi Bouzid?" And Kowalski slid out from under the car and looked at him, and his son said. His father's face did something he had never seen it do in 26 years. The man had been a 19-year-old from Scranton, doing trigonometry with a slide rule, while sweat dripped onto a plotting chart in a cellar in Tunisia. They talked for 4 hours. His son sat in the corner and listened to a man he had never met wearing his father's face. Peter Emmerich made brigadier general and taught at Leavenworth until 1961, and in every lecture he gave on massed fires, he used the same phrase, "This was not invented by an institution." Harlan Vance, the man who had nearly sent Kowalski to a depot in Casablanca, retired in 1947, and in his final efficiency report on the officer who had broken every rule he had spent 25 years writing, he wrote one line, "He was right earlier than we were." But Kowalski's real legacy was never going to be in a medal citation. Because the thing built in that cellar did not stop in 1945. It metastasized. By the end of the war, the American Army had fired approximately 47 million artillery rounds in the European theater alone. Post-war analysis of German casualties on the Western Front attributed somewhere between 50 and 75% of all losses to artillery fire. Not tanks, not aircraft, not infantry. Guns directed by voices arriving without warning. The German army that had taught the world blitzkrieg was in the end taken apart by a fire direction procedure. 5 years later, on a frozen ridge in Korea, it happened again and worse. At Chipyong-ni in February 1951, at Outpost Harry at the Punch Bowl. Chinese human wave assaults broke against massed American fires that arrived in a single second with no warning. Chinese after-action reports from 1951 read like translations of German reports from 1944. An enemy who could not be seen fire, that could not be predicted, the impossibility of assembling troops within 8 miles of an American observer. During the battle for Outpost Harry, over 8 days in June 1953, American artillery fired more than 100,000 rounds in support of a position held by a single company. The principle was Kowalski's exactly. One man who can see, every gun that can reach. In Vietnam, the fire-based system was built on the same skeleton. An entire strategic architecture derived from a single question. Can an observer here reach guns there in under 5 minutes? At landing zone, X-ray in the Ia Drang. In November 1965, 400 Americans, surrounded by 2,000 North Vietnamese, survived because artillery from landing zone Falcon fired more than 4,000 rounds in 2 days, onto coordinates called by men who could see nothing but elephant grass and muzzle flashes. Every army on Earth copied it. The British, the French, the Soviets, who studied, captured American procedures obsessively and rebuilt their entire artillery doctrine around massed simultaneous fires, a doctrine their successors still use. By the 1970s, there was not a serious army on the planet that fired artillery any other way. And then, the machines caught up to the idea. The FADAC computer in 1960 did in seconds what a 19-year-old from Scranton did in 4 minutes, with a slide rule. TAC fire. AFATDS. By Desert Storm in 1991, an American observer could call 12 battalions, and the solution was computed before he finished his sentence. Today, a soldier with a laser designator and a radio can put a GPS-guided shell through a specific window from 30 kilometers away. And every part of that transaction, the forward eye, the open net, the direct authority of the man who can see the massed simultaneous arrival, is a straight descendant of a seller in Tunisia in 1943. Even the civilian world inherited it, though it does not know. The logic of pushing decision authority down to the person with direct observation, of stripping out layers of approval that add latency, but not information, of trusting the man at the edge, because he is the only one who can actually see, is now the organizing principle of every emergency dispatch system, every distributed network, every well-run company on Earth. We just call it something else now. But the biggest lesson in this story was never about artillery. Look at what actually happened here. The idea did not come from the Command and General Staff College. It did not come from a war college paper or a general's memoir. It came from a man who fixed transmissions, because a man who fixed transmissions understood in his hands, and not his head, that a system is only as fast as its slowest connection, and that a beautiful engine connected to a kinked hose is a lawn ornament. The institution rejected it, and the institution was not stupid, and this is the part everyone gets wrong. Harlan Vance was not a villain. Every objection he raised was correct. The chain of command existed because men had died without it. The approval layers were built out of the corpses of 1918. The system rejected the innovation not out of arrogance, but out of memory, and that is what makes it a tragedy instead of a morality play. Institutions do not resist change because they are foolish. They resist because they are haunted, and the ghosts are real, and the ghosts are also sometimes wrong. History is full of this. Billy Mitchell sank a battleship from the air in 1921 and was court-martialed for saying what it meant. The British Admiralty resisted the convoy system through 1917, while shipping losses climbed toward starvation because convoys were considered defensive and unbecoming. The Wehrmacht itself was built by officers like Guderian, who were told throughout the 1930s that massed independent armor was a fantasy. Every single one of those ideas was called insane by serious, experienced, honest men who had excellent reasons. And that is the real content of Kasserine Pass, which is where this whole story began. The Germans looked at burning Shermans in February 1943 and produced a diagnosis that was correct in every tactical particular and catastrophically wrong. In one respect, they assumed what they saw was permanent. They mistook a snapshot for a portrait. They took the most valuable gift an army can receive, a perfect, unsparing audit of every weakness, and they handed it to their enemy, and then they spent 15 months studying their own success, while their enemy studied its own failure. One army treated war as an art form it had already mastered. The other treated it as an engineering problem it had not yet solved. Only one of those postures can learn. And there is one last detail that almost nobody knows. Go into the archives and look for the origin of time on target, and you will find a strange thing nobody agrees. The British claim aversion at Alamein. American accounts credit fire direction development at Fort Sill in the late 1930s to officers like Carlos Brewer and Orlando Ward, who built the mathematical groundwork years before Tunisia. Others point to Italy. The paper trail is a swamp. Ask the question, who invented it? And the archives return a shrug. And that shrug is the answer. Because it was not invented once. It was invented over and over independently by dozens of men in dozens of cellars and ditches, all of whom looked at the same broken thing and saw the same obvious fix, and every one of them was told no, and most of them stopped and a few did not. The reason the innovation has no father is that it had 40 of them, and the institution absorbed all 40 without recording a single name and then printed the result in a manual as though it had always been there. Here is the twist. That is not a failure of the record. That is the actual mechanism of how the American army won. The Germans could not have produced this, even if they had thought of it, because their military culture ran on genius. The great captain, the Feldherr, the mystical Kampfgeist that was the birthright of the German soldier. In that world, an idea belongs to the man who has it, and rank determines who is permitted to have ideas. A sergeant with a plotting table is an absurdity. The American army won because it was a machine for taking ideas away from the men who had them, stripping off their names and issuing them to 2 million strangers. That is a brutal thing. It is also the single most powerful engine of adaptation ever built. It cost Ray Kowalski his place in history. It bought the world Normandy. So, from a transmission mechanic in Toledo, with an idea called suicidal, to a procedure that dismantled the best army in the world, and is still today in every fire mission fired by every army on Earth. Ray Kowalski proved that the most dangerous thing an institution can do is win so decisively that it stops asking questions, and that the man who can actually see the target should be the man who pulls the trigger. 50 to 75% of all German dead on the Western Front came from that idea. It has been in continuous use for 83 years. His name is not on it. It is not on anything. He fixed transmissions until 1976. He is buried in Toledo under a stone that says only his name, his dates, and the words U.S. Army. Kasserine Pass was not a verdict. It was tuition. The Germans won that battle so completely that it confirmed everything they already believed, and in that moment of perfect confirmation, they stopped learning, and a nation of shopkeepers and mechanics and farm boys who had just been humiliated in the desert went back to the drawing board and rebuilt itself from the studs. The Germans won the first test, and in winning it, they handed the Americans the answer key to the final exam. Armies do not lose wars because they are outgunned. They lose because somewhere in a warm room far behind the front, they decided they already knew the answer.